It was a cold, crisp January afternoon in 2008, and London Heathrow, the busiest airport in Europe, was bracing for another routine arrival of a long-haul jet. Hundreds of flights touched down here every day, but what was about to happen would shock both the aviation industry and the public. On approach to runway 27L, a British Airways Boeing 777 descended steadily through the winter sky. The passengers on board had just completed a marathon flight of nearly 12 hours from Beijing. Cabin crew were securing the cabin, passengers were fastening seatbelts, and in the cockpit the flight crew were running through the final landing checklists. Everything appeared perfectly normal. And then, without warning, something unprecedented occurred. As the aircraft descended through 600 feet, just seconds from touchdown, both Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines, massive power plants that had carried the jet safely across thousands of miles, failed to respond to throttle inputs. Instead of providing the thrust needed for a stable landing, the engines produced only a faint idle power. The jet, with 152 souls on board, was gliding silently and uncontrollably toward the suburbs of London. In those few seconds, the margin for error was razor thin. If the aircraft fell short of the runway, it could plow into houses, roads, or even motorway traffic. The fact that this was happening to a Boeing 777 made it even more shocking. Up until that day, the 777 was regarded as one of the safest airliners ever built, with a flawless safety record and no hull losses in commercial service. That reputation was about to be tested in the most dramatic way imaginable. This was British Airways Flight 38. The story began at Beijing Capital International Airport, where British Airways operated its scheduled daily service to London. On the 17th of January 2008, Flight 38 prepared for departure with 136 passengers and 16 crew members. The flight was scheduled to cover over 5,000 miles, crossing the vast expanse of Siberia, Northern Europe, and finally into the United Kingdom. The aircraft assigned to this journey was a Boeing 777-236ER. Registration GYMMM. This particular jet had been delivered brand new to British Airways in 2001, and was considered one of the airline's most advanced aircraft at the time. Powered by two Rolls-Royce Trent 895 engines, the twinjet was designed for long-haul operations, with the ability to fly extended distances even with one engine out. The Boeing 777 was often described by pilots as one of the most reliable and pilot-friendly aircraft ever produced. Its safety record was stellar, and for passengers, it represented comfort and confidence. That confidence would soon be tested in unimaginable ways. At the controls that day was Captain Peter Burkill, a seasoned pilot with thousands of hours of experience, much of it on the 777. He was joined by First Officer John Coward, also highly experienced, and two other pilots rotating duties on the long flight. The cockpit crew had flown this route many times before, and nothing about Flight 38 suggested it would be different from any other transcontinental service. British Airways had, at the time, an excellent safety record. Known as one of the world's most respected flag carriers, it placed heavy emphasis on crew training, safety drills, and strict operational procedures. Passengers boarding BA-38 that day had every reason to expect a safe and uneventful trip home to London. For most of the flight, everything was uneventful. The jet departed Beijing on time, climbed smoothly into the winter skies, and crossed northern China without incident. The flight path took it across Mongolia, Siberia, and the frozen landscapes of Russia. Cabin service proceeded as normal, with meals served, lights dimmed, and passengers settling into their long-haul routines. By the time the aircraft crossed into European airspace, the crew were already preparing for their descent into London. The weather over southern England was typical for January. Cold, but clear skies and light winds, favorable conditions for an approach into Heathrow. There was no turbulence, no storms, and no warnings of anything unusual. Flight 38 was set up for what should have been a routine landing at one of the world's busiest airports. It is important to understand the backdrop against which this event unfolded. The Boeing 777 had entered service in 1995 and quickly earned a reputation as one of the safest and most reliable commercial aircraft ever built. Airlines around the world adopted it as the backbone of their long-haul fleets. By 2008, not a single Boeing 777 had ever been lost in an accident. For passengers and crew, that record provided reassurance. The aircraft they were flying on was statistically one of the safest places to be. For British Airways, which had operated the type since 1995, the 777 was a workhorse that had delivered millions of passengers safely to their destinations. That reputation would change in the space of a few seconds as Flight 38 descended over West London. As the jet lined up with runway 27L, the passengers could see the iconic sights of London sprawling beneath them. The cabin crew instructed everyone to return seats to upright positions and fasten belts. The pilots extended the landing gear, lowered the flaps, and reduced thrust to set up a smooth landing profile. Inside the cockpit, all systems appeared normal. The aircraft was descending at the correct glide path, the airspeed was stable, and the approach was fully under control. But then, just when the crew commanded more thrust to adjust their descent, the engines failed to deliver the expected power. Instead of the reassuring roar of acceleration, the engines remained at idle. The Boeing 777, one of the most technologically advanced jets in service, was losing power at the very moment it needed it most. Captain Burkill and First Officer Coward had only seconds to react. With houses, roads, and the perimeter of Heathrow just ahead, the situation was becoming critical. In that cockpit, the crew were staring at a nightmare scenario. Both engines, starved of thrust, left the aircraft gliding toward one of the busiest metropolitan areas in the world. Passengers braced as the jet lost height, and the crew wrestled with the controls to coax every bit of lift out of the massive wings. This was not just a technical failure, it was the first time in the history of the Boeing 777 that such a catastrophic incident had occurred. As Flight 38 sank lower, the question was no longer whether the aircraft could land smoothly, it was whether it could make the runway at all. And that is where the real drama of this story begins. As Flight 38 descended toward Heathrow, the situation became more critical with every passing second. In the cockpit, Captain Peter Burkill and First Officer John Coward immediately pushed the throttles forward, expecting the Rolls-Royce engines to deliver the thrust needed to carry the jet safely over the threshold of the runway. But the engines did not respond. The aircraft, heavy with passengers, luggage, and fuel from a transcontinental flight, continued to sink below the glide path. At barely 600 feet above the ground, with less than a mile to go, the crew realized they were in the middle of an unprecedented emergency. Captain Burkill called for more power. The engines spooled slightly but stayed at idle, failing to generate the thrust demanded. The cockpit filled with the unnerving silence of engines refusing to respond. Coward, who was flying the aircraft at the time, pulled back gently on the control column, trying to stretch every last bit of lift from the wings. The stall warning was close to triggering, but if they pitched down too far, the aircraft would slam into the ground short of the airport. Burkill quickly lowered the landing gear and flaps fully, hoping to stabilize the descent, but the aircraft was still losing energy. Below, traffic moved along the busy A30 road that runs parallel to Heathrow's runways. Just beyond the perimeter fence lay houses, cars, and one of the most densely populated areas of London. If the 777 fell short, the result could have been catastrophic. Every decision in those seconds mattered. The crew made a desperate decision. Keep the nose up just enough to clear the boundary of the airport and aimed the aircraft toward the open grass before the runway. Burkill took control, guiding the jet as it dropped alarmingly low. The glide was silent except for the wind rushing over the wings and the faint idle hum of the engines. Passengers later recalled being able to see people on the ground and cars moving on nearby roads. The approach was far too low, and the massive aircraft was barely staying airborne. At 12:42 p.m. local time, with the runway only seconds away, Flight 38 crossed Heathrow's perimeter fence. The landing gear clipped the grass, tearing through a patch of the airfield before striking heavily. The plane slammed into the ground, short of the runway, in a high sink rate impact. The main landing gear collapsed, the nose gear broke, and the right engine detached from its pylon. The aircraft skidded violently across the grass, carving a deep scar into the earth, before coming to rest just short of runway 27L. Inside the cabin, the force of the impact sent shockwaves through passengers and crew. Overhead bins burst open, luggage tumbled into the aisles, and oxygen masks dropped as the aircraft shook violently. Miraculously, the fuselage remained intact. There was no fire, and the cabin did not fill with smoke, a stroke of luck that almost certainly saved lives. Crew members immediately initiated evacuation procedures, directing passengers to the nearest exits. Slides were deployed, and people began rushing out of the stricken aircraft. Rescue vehicles at Heathrow responded within minutes, racing toward the scene as passengers streamed out onto the grass. Miraculously, everyone on board survived. There were 13 injuries, 1 serious, but no fatalities. For a large wide-body jet carrying 152 people, this outcome was extraordinary. Captain Burkill and First Officer Coward had managed to save every life on board despite losing thrust on both engines at the most critical stage of flight. The scene stunned the aviation world. Here was the first hull loss of a Boeing 777, a type that until this day had enjoyed a flawless safety record. The aircraft was destroyed, written off where it lay, but the survival of all passengers was hailed as a testament to the crew's skill and composure under impossible circumstances. Yet the question lingered: how could both engines of one of the world's most reliable airliners fail at the same moment, on final approach in clear weather conditions? Investigators quickly cordoned off the wreckage, securing the black boxes and beginning their work. What they would uncover would point not to a mechanical fault or a maintenance lapse, but to something no one had ever anticipated in the design of modern jet engines. The true cause lay hidden within the fuel system, triggered by conditions unique to long-haul flights through extreme cold. What followed would shake confidence in aviation's assumptions about fuel behavior and engine reliability. The answers would only emerge after months of meticulous investigation, testing, and analysis. For now, as the wreckage of GYMMM sat just yards from Heathrow's runway, the focus was on the remarkable fact that every soul on board had survived what could so easily have been one of London's worst aviation disasters. In the hours after the crash of British Airways Flight 38, investigators from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, or AAIB, arrived on scene at Heathrow. The Boeing 777 lay crippled just short of the runway, its landing gear collapsed and its right engine detached, but remarkably intact. Passengers' belongings were scattered across the grass, and deep scars in the soil showed where the aircraft had dug in before coming to rest. The survival of all 152 people on board was already being called a miracle, but for investigators, one question towered above all others. How could both engines of a modern airliner fail simultaneously on final approach? The black boxes were quickly recovered and sent for analysis. Data from the flight data recorder confirmed the crew's account. Both Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines had failed to respond to throttle commands during the final approach. The cockpit voice recorder revealed calm, focused communication between Captain Peter Burkill and First Officer John Coward as they fought to keep the aircraft flying. There was no evidence of panic, No sign of crew error. The focus shifted to the engines and the fuel system. Initial theories considered a range of possibilities. Could it have been contaminated fuel loaded in Beijing? Was there ice in the fuel system? Or perhaps a sudden bird strike, though none had been reported. Investigators collected fuel samples from the aircraft, but analysis showed it was clean and within specifications. Attention turned to the environmental conditions. On its journey from Beijing, Flight 38 had spent hours flying over Siberia, where outside air temperatures at cruising altitude were as low as -74 degrees Celsius. Jet fuel is designed to remain liquid under such conditions, but investigators wondered whether the extreme cold had played a role. As the analysis deepened, engineers from Boeing and Rolls-Royce joined the investigation. The data showed that fuel was flowing normally throughout most of the flight. But as the aircraft descended into London, the engines demanded more thrust. At that moment, fuel flow to both engines had become restricted. The blockage wasn't in the tanks themselves, but somewhere further along the system. After extensive laboratory testing and recreations, the culprit was identified: ice crystals. Jet fuel naturally contains trace amounts of water. In the extreme cold of long-haul flights, these trace amounts can form tiny ice particles, usually harmless. But in this case, over many hours of exposure to subarctic conditions, those particles had accumulated and lodged in the fuel oil heat exchangers inside the Trent 800 engines. When the crew called for power on final approach, the sudden rush of warmer fuel dislodged the accumulated ice. Instead of melting instantly, the ice clumped together and blocked the narrow passages of the heat exchangers, restricting fuel flow. Both engines were starved of the fuel they needed, leaving the 777 unable to respond at the most critical moment. The discovery was groundbreaking. No one had anticipated that ice buildup in this part of the engine could lead to a dual-engine failure. The design had passed all certification requirements, and millions of flight hours had been logged without issue. Flight 38 revealed a hidden vulnerability in modern aviation technology. The investigation's final report concluded that the cause of the accident was fuel flow restriction due to ice crystals in the fuel oil heat exchangers. Importantly, it also highlighted the outstanding performance of the flight crew, whose quick decisions and skilled handling prevented the loss of life. The findings prompted urgent action. Rolls-Royce redesigned the fuel oil heat exchangers used in Trent 800 engines, creating wider flow passages to prevent ice blockages. Boeing issued service bulletins, and aviation regulators mandated modifications across the global fleet of Boeing 777s powered by these engines. The incident also led to new guidance for airlines operating long-haul flights in extreme cold conditions, ensuring fuel temperatures were closely monitored and managed. For the passengers, the experience was unforgettable. Many described the surreal silence as the engines failed to respond and the terrifying moment of impact. Some suffered injuries, while others walked away shaken but alive. Their survival was credited not only to the skill of the crew but also to the structural strength of the Boeing 777, which absorbed the crash forces without breaking apart or catching fire. In the aftermath, Captain Peter Burkill and First Officer John Coward were praised worldwide. Coward, who had been the pilot flying during the approach, was especially recognized for his calm handling of the crippled jet. Both men later described the experience as the most challenging moment of their careers. For Burkill, however, the incident also brought unwanted media attention and stress that eventually led him to step away from British Airways, though he later returned to flying. Flight 38 marked a turning point in aviation safety. It demonstrated once again that even the most advanced aircraft can reveal unexpected vulnerabilities, but it also showcased the resilience of modern aviation. Robust design, effective crew training, and the ability to learn from incidents to make flying safer for the future. Today, the wreck of GYMMM no longer exists, dismantled after the investigation concluded. But the legacy of Flight 38 lives on in the redesigned engines, the improved fuel system protections, and in the countless lives that may one day be saved because of what was learned from that cold January afternoon in London. The story of British Airways Flight 38 is one of shock, survival, and discovery. What began as a routine transcontinental flight ended as a narrow escape from disaster and a case study that changed aviation forever. Above all, it stands as a testament to the professionalism of the crew, the strength of the aircraft, and the constant vigilance of an industry that refuses to stand still when lessons are written in the scarred earth just short of a runway.